What's the main title of this panel? Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Those of you following us on the live stream, again, thank you for bearing with us during the lunch break. I hope everybody enjoyed their lunch. And we're headed to, we're about to start the fourth panel for today. Trauma, violence, and rehabilitation and reintegration programming. And I actually have the privilege of moderating this panel, and I did that absolutely on purpose because I have the privilege to work with everybody here, even Heidi, who's joining us online, unfortunately couldn't join us in person. And I mean, all of them are excellent professionals, but on top of that, they're also excellent human beings. So yes, that is something that you don't find often. So I'm very, very happy to, to be moderating this panel and learning as I always do from them. So for today, the panelists are Dr. Stevan Weine, professor in psychiatry at the University of Illinois Chicago College of Medicine, where he's also the director of global medicine and the director of the Center for Global Health. And well, Steve has ample experience. Over 30 years, he's been conducting research both with refugees and migrants in the US and in post-conflict countries, focused on mental health, health and violence prevention. And his research mission is to develop, implement, and evaluate psychosocial interventions that are feasible, acceptable, and effective with respect to the complex real-life context where at-risk populations live. And his, for the sake of time, Steve, I hope you don't mind that I was going to say there's so much that I could talk about. With us today is also Noah Tucker. Here somewhere. Noah Tucker, who's a program associate at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs Central Asia program. He was previously the executive director for Not in Our Name film and television series, the first region-wide project designed to prevent violent extremism in Central Asia through community dialogues in areas most directly affected by recruitment to Syria. Again, lots of ample experience that I could go on and on about. We've also already seen his language skills with, Russian. Thank you for that again. And he's currently a recipient of the Handa Studentship at the Handa Centre for Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And he serves on the advisory board of Counter-Extremism Project. He most recently conducted fieldwork on reintegration efforts for returnees from the Syrian conflict in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan between November and December of 2021. Heidi Ellis is joining us online, and she is an associate professor in psychology and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital and a licensed clinical psychologist. She's also the director of the Trauma and Community Resilience Center at the Boston Children's Hospital and a partner in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Her primary focus is understanding and promoting youth mental health and well-being, with a particular emphasis on understanding how trauma exposure, violence, and the social context impact development trajectories. And Heidi, I'm sorry, I'm not going to read your whole CV because it's so much. I'm really, really privileged. But worth mentioning that she also directs the Massachusetts Area Prevention Framework, a multidisciplinary team approach to preventing targeted violence and terrorism among adolescents. And last but definitely not least, Mike Nikonchuk. Hold on a minute. Mike, where are you? Sorry about this. I don't know. Well,
it's okay. Just some guy.
No, you're not just some guy. He's
I think the most painful part of any workshop is having to sit through someone reading your biography.
Yeah. Listen, I have to, okay?
I know.
So, Mike Nikonchuk is a practitioner and researcher at the intersection of mental health and psychosocial support, forced migration, and violent conflict prevention. He has worked extensively in the implementation and evaluation of evidence-based care for persons affected by violent conflict, extremism, and forced displacement, including the rehabilitation and reintegration of persons affiliated with extremist groups. He's also the author of the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, a co-author of the U.S. Institute for Peace RISE Action Guide for the reintegration of extremism-affiliated adults, and of course a whole number of other publications. He, excuse me, currently serves as a program manager with the Weine Collective, and he is a member of the UNDP's expert roster on mental health and psychosocial support and preventing violent extremism, and also serves on the advisory board of CEP. So I think that puts us on a very good trajectory to what we're going to be discussing today. And without further ado, Steve, please go ahead.
Okay.
You,
Should I go up or?
whatever you want. I think
I thought we had a pact.
the pact was just three, but
I'll do it like this. Okay.
yep.
So I was asked to say a few words about trauma in relationship to these kinds of processes that we're talking about today. So for those of you who know a lot, forgive me if it's too low, and for those who don't know a lot, forgive me if it's too high. But we do know quite a bit about trauma, and I think we're just at the beginning of learning about how trauma fits in with the violent extremism journey pictured here. Okay, here's how I control it.
Yes.
Just to be clear, these are some definitions of trauma.
Steve, you're
Okay, an emotional wound of shock or lasting effect. When we think about post-traumatic stress disorder, the DSM-5 has a very specific definition, which refers to exposure to death or threat of death or threat of serious physical injury, sexual violence. But trauma doesn't only happen to individuals; it happens to large groups, to society as a whole, as we're witnessing in the media nowadays in Israel and Gaza. So collective trauma has been defined as the psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect the entire society. And we'll get into that more, and I think Noah might touch on that as well. If we think, so the first intellectual challenge, is to think about trauma in relationship to this journey of violent extremism. And if you've worked with people in this space, then you know that there's many different ways that trauma can appear. And so this one, I'm doing it on two screens at once. So this shows those different stages of the journey. So a person could have had adverse childhood experiences. They could have been involved in some kind of risky behavior. They could be amidst historical, intergenerational, or communal or collective traumas. In the phase of engagement and recruitment, they may have been a witness to violence through social media or through real life. They might have experienced some kind of hazing. What? Okay.
I'm just listening to you.
While they're in the thick of it, they may have been exposed to any of these things: hatred, dehumanization, violence. They may have perpetrated those things. Then their criminal justice system involvement exposes them to trauma potentially through incarceration, the impact on the family. And then the experience of disengagement or re-entry could also be associated with trauma. Now, I'm not saying these things always happen. Some people, they may never happen. Some people, they may happen in one place and no other place. But these are the things we should think about. There are some studies. Pete Simi did a study of white supremacists and found these kinds of percentages of childhood adversity, ranging from 20 to as high as 70%. Kind of depends what you define as trauma, how high or low the bar is. There was a good Campbell review, which shows many risk factors for. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep reminding me to do that.
Okay.
That's the Pete Simi one of different child traumas, and then this is the Campbell review, which shows there are many different risk and protective factors that are statistically related to violent extremism, and you could see that one of them is, have you been abused, in the third or fourth column on the right. So there's a statistical association, and large systematic reviews. So that means that we should pay attention to this. Daniel Kohler has written that a core mechanism of violent extremist radicalization processes is to combine constant traumatic and therapeutic elements to foster commitment and embeddedness into the extremist milieu. And we've heard those stories from the people who've been there. So how can trauma change the journey? That's, I think, what we need to grapple with. And, you know, it may change it or it may not change it. I mean, trauma can, for some people, just be a difficult life experience, like many others, that doesn't seriously change them or wound them. And let's also always remember that trauma can be an opportunity for growth and resilience, and for I'd say most people it is. Trauma could lead to some kind of diagnosis or condition, like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety or substance abuse problem. Trauma can also be an accelerant of other kinds of attitudes or behaviors, like intolerance or proclivity towards violence. And trauma can be a disruptor. It can be a disruptor of relationships. It could be a disruptor of rehabilitation programming, just like it disrupts so many other kinds of resources in life, and also medical or mental health treatments. So for that reason, we want to know about it. We want to know, and we want to try to understand what role it could be playing in the person or persons that we're working with. When we think about, now I want to think about not just like, is it there, but what to do about it. So when we think about interventions and strategies for interventions, big picture, there are 5 kinds of things that we always want to do with trauma-related interventions, as highlighted here. Promote sense of safety, promote calming, promote sense of self and collective efficacy, promote connectedness, and promote hope. So I'm always asking myself, like, where are we, and what am I doing to help the person in each of these areas? This is like the slide that you showed earlier. Not everybody is going to get therapy. In fact, most people are never going to get therapy. They're not going to see a clinical mental health specialist. But care can be delivered at many other different levels. And you could say the top level is specialized services by a mental health specialist, you know, in individual psychotherapy or something. But this is, the next level down is focused person-to-person, non-specialist supports, say like a lay community worker, or could be a probation officer, strengthening community and family supports, and then social considerations and basic services and security. So we're always thinking what can be done at each of these levels in order to maximize the support for a person. I think when you think about trauma, it asks us to change the lens a little bit by which we look at people. And I think it's well represented in this quote. It can transform the service focus from a more antagonistic, what's wrong with you, to and more engaging, what happened to you in your life? You know, what have you been through? What have you lived through? Now, it's not to say that we're not saying that what you've been through is justification for things that you've done, but we're just saying, I want to know about it. It had some impact on you. It shaped you, and let's start there. People usually experience that as an invitation and a welcome invitation, and I think it's important that you signal that you want to hear that and you want to learn about that. I don't recommend this for people who aren't doing therapy. Thank you. But in therapy, we sometimes get to this question or this issue. Behaviors that lead to violence to self or others could be a person's best attempt to communicate or mitigate the innumerable effects of the traumas they have experienced. I wouldn't walk in with that presumption, but that I sometimes have that as a question in my mind that could be explored in conversations with the person. But again, I wouldn't do this outside of a therapeutic meeting, but I'm trying to kind of tell you why this matters. So, Heidi in a few minutes is going to talk about 5R programming, and but I need to preempt it a little bit just to say a few things. So we created this framework to explain all the different kinds of things that we think are happening in what we typically are calling now R&R, rehabilitation, reintegration, because we found that there wasn't enough there and to really explain what's going on. We thought it takes 5 R's, and we think that they're all very different and complementary in important ways. Heidi will give you more on that. But the 5 R's are release and reentry, reintegration, rehabilitation, and resilience. So we use the word rehabilitation in a much more specific way than the general, like we're going to make bad things better, that's focused on, in this case, more about helping the person to not re-engage in crime or get involved in crime in the first place. So if you think about there are these different phases involved in the work that we do, then you could think that there are actually trauma-informed interventions that go at each of these different phases. So, for example, early on in release and reentry, it's about evaluating the person to try to stabilize them if they're in crisis or to try to plan for treatment. Teaching self-management strategies for stress and traumatic stress, very important. These are something that any caseworker, layperson can do in 10 or 15 minutes and very valuable. During reintegration, maybe person gets treatment for mental health problems if needed, strengthening family and social supports, promoting a welcoming community. In the rehabilitation phase, trauma work has to be integrated into specialized training on cognitive flexibility, acceptance of diversity, distress tolerance, and nonviolent coping, or else the person will not be able to successfully engage in those things. And then we think of resilience as the last phase of this, which has to do with expanding social opportunities to enhance growth and connection, and mentoring and counseling to strengthen coping strategies. So without getting into too much detail, trauma-focused work belongs in each of those phases. So there's a lot of things that can be done here. It's amazing how I never remember that.
It happens, listen.
Look, we need to be able to assess for trauma-related attitudes, behaviors, and symptoms using standardized tools, and there are very simple screening mechanisms, screening tools, which can be done in 2 minutes with people, and more complex ones. We need to understand the trauma in relation to the journey that I started with. We need to use some kind of multi-dimensional phased model, such as this 5R model. And then we need to figure out how to integrate trauma-informed practices into that model. We need to help survivors manage safety, emotional dysregulation, and build supports. And we need to train frontline practitioners and mental health specialists in trauma-informed practices within PVE, including things like psychological first aid and skills for psychological recovery, which are evidence-based strategies. So the point is, I guess, that we're not leaving everything for those specialists at the top of the triangle. We're trying to build in different ways that everyone at all levels can be involved in this. So that's all I really have to say. There are a lot of readings here. There we go, just to be consistent. There are a lot of readings. Go to the QR code, and I've collected a bunch of readings that I found to be useful in this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. No.
It's me.
But you can stay. You can follow the pact.
Follow the pact.
Whatever.
Okay, so I tried to reorganize a little bit what I was thinking about saying as we go to best complement the other people that are here on this panel and our other presenters today, because we have really just an incredibly rich group of people to learn from and listen to, and whose experiences are are so important. And I think it was really, really helpful earlier today to hear from someone with lived experience of these processes, because these are often voices that are left out. So I have a few things that I want to tell you about mobilization to Syria and Central Asia, and bringing people back from that process, and sort of what maybe we can learn from the Central Asian experience for the rest of the world. And these things are not sort of like clearly tied into a single narrative. Usually when I give a longer version of these presentations, what I like to do is show you lots of pictures of a place, so you can feel sort of a connection with that. But today we'll stick with just headlines and leave time for questions for other things. But I will explain, I guess, that my approach to these things is shaped from working on Central Asian mobilization to violent extremism for a long time now, for I guess something like 15 or 16 years. And the process itself has changed a lot, and my approach to it has changed in that I get to look at it in different ways. Earlier in my career, I looked at how radicalization and recruiting processes were happening more on an individual level. I worked in some of, I wrote one of USAID's development approaches to violent extremism for Uzbekistan. That was a really good series, and I was happy to be a part of that. And that began to push things in a little bit of a different direction, to looking at structural things and community level issues. And as there was a huge change that came to the way that I understand these things myself, going from watching people get recruited or listening to people talking about having been recruited or why they're in Syria and why they're doing what they do or why they believe in these things, to sitting in the home of a grieving mother in the middle of nowhere in the desert in Kazakhstan, in a dark apartment because she couldn't really afford to keep the lights on during the day when she didn't absolutely need it, in a place where she and her family had been relocated because, this is a lot to unpack. The entire city where she had grown up and where her son, who's now dead because he was killed in Syria, was born, has been demolished because it was controlled by a mining company that decided that the trace resources that they could scrape out from below the city by this ever-widening strip mine was worth more than all of the people's homes and their childhood memories and everything else. And at this point, her whole city that she had grown up in is being bulldozed, one thing at a time, one home, one community center, one restaurant at a time. And in the middle of this, her son disappears one day. He's like 16 years old. And he reappears a few months later on a video in Syria with a gun. And she could not make any sense of this. And I couldn't make any sense of it for her either. And we were there asking if she wanted to participate in this documentary project that we're making. She absolutely did not want it. She yelled at us and said, like, what good is it going to do me to do this? She already had all of this attention from the security services that she didn't need. But in that moment, like, we could sit there and listen to her story. And so that's what we did. Never used it for anything. We just had this one moment where we could sit together as human beings and sit in the situation that she was in and that she had lived through, and try to begin to retrace all of these things that had happened in her own community that made all of this possible, that led to this tragedy that she had lived through. And so that leads to kind of one of the primary takeaways that we've gotten from all of this, from beginning to look at mobilization, to the communities where the mobilization happened, to now return and reintegration, often back into these same communities. Certainly not that town, because it no longer exists. I tried to take Steve there in December, and there was absolutely nothing left. It was just a flat, snow-covered plain. Everything about it had been erased off the map. And that town itself had been officers' quarters for the Soviet prison camp that had overseen with extreme violence the forced labor that had built the city in the first place and the cities around it. So what I'm getting at with this is to say that one of the first things that we find when we look at all layers of this process is that the Central Asian mobilization doesn't happen in an even way. It wasn't like 1 in every 10,000 people at random from Central Asia went to fight in Syria. Instead, when you put it on a map, you'll see these very bright hotspots where people from a particular demographic group, from a particular place, often went in pretty large numbers. There's a village just down, sort of down the road from the city that no longer exists, that had the highest per capita mobilization I had ever found anywhere. It only has like maybe 800 people in it, and like 14 people from that town, from several different families, all went to Syria. Most of the men were killed, and the children have come back. And some of the people were sent back to live in the same place that they had left, with, in this case, no running water and no electricity half the time, and the rest of this, at the time that, their country, which has a tremendous amount of oil wealth, is building this glittering capital city a few hundred miles away, and millions of miles away from what people can hope to achieve in this place. So what we see in a lot of the Central Asian hotspots is kind of I know that it's not good to invent new terms when it's not really necessary or not justifiable, but as we try to understand intergenerational trauma and how trauma is passed on from one generation to another, I think one of the things that we see in these communities in Central Asia as a type of collective trauma is a kind of multi-generational trauma, where we have, if you take a place like that one community, in the first major trauma begins in the 19th century when the Russian Empire walks in and takes over the land of nomadic Kazakhs who had lived in the same way in relationship to that land for centuries and centuries. And then the Soviet collectivization happens, and they almost overnight destroy the whole way of life that Kazakhs have lived for centuries and centuries, and change their fundamental relationship to the land, and in the process kill up to half of all living Kazakhs. So this is a massive layer of trauma, and all of the systems of care and rituals and religious beliefs and all of these things that they had to help one another endure traumas like this are taken out from under them. They build a Soviet system that seems to work pretty well, despite being built on forced slave labor, and then that collapses out from under them in 1991, basically overnight. and they have to navigate an entirely new system of what's essentially neoliberalism on steroids, where everything, especially in an oil-rich state, becomes part of the market economy. So you can see people being affected by changes that happen to their parents and across generations. But then one of the other things that's really particularly useful about the traumatic lens for this, I think, is that you see a really profound disruption in each of these shifts in the systems of care that people had for one another, the way that they could find comfort or meaning in the traumas that they'd lived through. And it's not particularly surprising, I guess, that in places like this, a very small percentage of the population turns to a group like ISIS as an alternative to that, an adaptation really to the environment that they have lived in, and an adaptation that is certainly maladaptive, and it's not one that we want to endorse, but one that maybe we can understand if we look at it through this lens of trauma. And that's not to take away from the importances of individual trauma. So one of the other major takeaways that comes, especially from getting to talk to returnees now, is that a huge number of them have lived through, both these really significant adverse childhood experiences, but also just really hard, direct personal traumas. For women, a really high number of the women who ended up in being mobilized to Syria in one way or the other lived through childhood sexual violence or sexual violence in their first marriages. And we see with a lot of the men also having lived through some kind of particular personal tragedy that affected them in a really difficult way and that they were struggling to make meaning out of and make connection to. And so we see trauma playing a role in both people who choose to mobilize, who make a conscious choice that they're going to go, and also people who become so vulnerable that they're no longer able to resist when somebody else in their family has decided to make this choice, or when their husband has decided to make this choice, or when their parents have decided to make this choice. Central Asian mobilization to Syria is unique because in Kazakhstan, the only country that we have hard numbers for, according to the government, women and children outnumbered men 5-1 in their mobilization to Syria. And certainly in the way that they come back, the numbers are even starker. So it doesn't help to talk about radicalization so much when you have so many people who had no agency in their process of being sent over, even if they spent a significant amount of time in a group like ISIS. Okay. So that's an advantage of looking at it from the traumatic lens, both on the individual level and the collective level. It helps us understand why more people might merge their own traumatic narratives with the traumatic narrative that is presented by a group like ISIS and the grievances that they claim, and also why so many people lacked the resources within their communities and within their networks that might have protected them. And I guess the final thing that I'll say to leave you with, and maybe even ending slightly ahead of, it's not possible. I won't end ahead of schedule. But the final thing that I want to leave you with about what we can learn from Central Asia is that I've been very privileged to get to work on the State Department grants and some other grants from USIP and others in each of the Central Asian countries, which have combined returned an order of magnitude more people from Syria than anywhere else in the world at this point. And I count 8 distinct approaches across these different countries. Each of the countries has multiple approaches to their return and reintegration programs. And from a point of view of recidivism and public safety, every one of these 8 approaches has worked. There has not been a case of a person acting out in a violent way, in an ideologically motivated violent way, among any of the almost 2,000 people that have been returned to Central Asia so far. So that tells us that from like this hard security perspective that we're first concerned about and the governments are first concerned about, even if you do nothing at all, which is one of the 8 approaches, and we won't say which countries that is, but even if you do nothing at all, it's probably okay. It will, from a public safety perspective, it will probably work out. Many of these people, like we talked about in a couple of the panels earlier, have seen the reality of what it was like inside ISIS's caliphate, and they know much better than us why they don't want to be a part of that anymore, or why that wasn't what it was cracked up to be. But if we measure success in a different way, if it's not about public safety, if it's about whether people can live, particularly children who have come back, can live healthy and well-adapted lives, then we start to see tremendous differences between the 8 approaches. And my pitch to leave you with for this would be to say that I think we need to set, as already many in this room have expressed, I think we need to set our goals a little bit differently and make sure that what we're measuring is success in terms of human security and improvements in the lives in those communities, so that this process doesn't just all start over again the next time there's a crisis. So I'll end with that and pass on to everybody else. Thank you all for listening to me ramble.
Thank you. Thank you. Before passing it on to Heidi, I thought that was very interesting, and just as a common thought for everybody that we can maybe pick back up through the Q&A, those changes, rapid changes in the environment, and you and I, Liz, you're looking at me, we've had this conversation before 1,000 times, how this conversation might be worth replicating in the United States, and maybe how those rapid changes in the environment in very recent years, very quickly, have probably advanced and, facilitated the situation that we're in today. But as I say, let's pick this back up in the Q&A. Heidi, please, go ahead. Oh, no. Now we...
That was just my mute button.
Okay.
I am hearing feedback, though. Is that possible? Okay, now it's better. Can you guys hear me? All right. First of all, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I wish I was there with you all. Second of all, very hard to follow Noah, because Noah, thank you for putting such a profoundly personal face to what we're talking about right now. And I think it's really important we hold that in mind. I have the problem now of following with more of a theoretically driven, dull presentation. But that said, as I begin to present this model that Steve referenced, a best practice model around what might we want to think about in terms of how we put programs together to support individuals who are leaving extremism, underlying all that I'm going to present is this idea that we need to be person-centered. And so even if I'm putting logic models and theory on the screen, what I'm hoping people will do as I talk is remember that this is person-centered. It's about an individual, about their well-being, and that intersection of kind of public safety really starts at that individual well-being locus. So with that, I'm trying to organize how slides are going to work here. So go ahead and we can go to the next slide. Just to acknowledge what I'm going to share is the work of many people, including many folks who are on this panel who have input into it. So this is some collective thinking. Next slide. The other thing I want to say is that the model that I'm talking about is grounded in the specific problem of women and children returning from formerly ISIS-controlled territories. So we reviewed practices around the globe working with this population and tried to think about what were some of the best practice elements that came together. We also reviewed some other literatures, which I'll talk about. Although I'm talking specifically about a model that was built around that population, I think, as Jon was just sort of referencing, the problem itself is not really unique to that population. And so thinking about how do we help individuals who have been in an extremist context, who are then leaving that, trying to re-enter into society and reestablish their sense of well-being in a way that is effective for them and safe for society. As we started looking at programs that worked with women and children around the globe, many of them were referred to as R&R, and that seemed to talk about rehabilitation, reintegration. Sometimes other R's were spliced in. Really what we found is that we needed a more comprehensive approach. And so we are talking about the 5 R's that Steve mentioned. Next slide, please. In looking at what's been done, we reviewed all the literature there was around R&R programs. We interviewed stakeholders. We held some expert working groups. And then we also looked at literature from adjacent fields because, of course, there's not a robust scientific literature around this particular problem. But we do know a lot about other groups who are moving into society, repatriation and reintegration, refugee research. We think about criminal justice and juvenile justice research. And we also looked at psychological resilience, which is really how do individuals encounter hardship and come out on the other side stable or even thriving. Next slide. So what we put together is this model called 5R that talks about what is not exactly phases because it's not all chronological, but these different domains of need that we need to be thinking about as we put programs together. Next slide, please. So for this particular population, we have talked about repatriation, resettlement, reintegration, rehabilitation, and resilience. And you might have noticed that Steve cleverly took the first 2 R's and said release and reentry, because again, I think there's a lot of applicability to domestic issues here and other populations that are dealing with this problem of reintegration. When we started to look at programs around the world, one of the first things we saw was that most of them were operating with maybe some implicit assumptions about what was going to work, but without a stated theory of change. A theory of change being a statement that describes the problem, its underlying assumptions, necessary activities, and desired outcomes. So we developed a theory of change that guides the work we're proposing, and I think you'll see how this connects to this idea of being very person-centered. So our theory of change is women and children returning from formerly violent extremist conflict have been exposed to trauma and adversity. They also face challenges upon returning to their countries of origin, including ruptured social networks, family conflict, community stigma, challenges of acculturation and resettlement stress, and identity conflicts with surrounding society. Unless these challenges are addressed, returning women and their children remain vulnerable to forming, retaining, or reestablishing ties with violent extremist networks as a means of fulfilling some or all of their needs. Thus, programming that addresses personal safety and well-being, promotes belonging and opportunity, and supports development of nonviolent skills and attitudes will contribute to disengagement from or decreased likelihood of engaging with violent extremist groups and ideologies. Next slide, please. And across this all, the long-term goal then is a life of nonviolence with safety, well-being, opportunity, belonging, and dignity. Next slide. So we took the different domains of activities, these 4 domains spread across 5 R's, and tried to assemble the beginning of a logic model, talking about to do these different phases, what are the inputs? Who might be holding some of the responsibility for this? What are the resources that we need? Then what are the core components? What actually are you doing and intending to during that phase or under that domain? And then finally, how do you know if you're being successful? What are the different outcomes that you're trying to achieve? So you can see, if you look at the inputs, This is not necessarily held just by government. There are different roles for different sectors of society to play, really taking that whole of society approach. Some of the initial work may be primarily held by governments and NGOs, but as you move towards sort of sustained, successful integration in community, we move towards less formal structures in some ways. So maybe multidisciplinary teams that pull in psychosocial supports and services, communities, families, thinking about how some of the less formal structures in society can play a really critical role in helping individuals to reintegrate. I'll talk through some of the core components and outcomes in the following slides. So let's keep going. Next slide, please. Okay, so the initial phases that we talk about are a repatriation and resettlement. And the focus here is really on physical, legal, and material safety. So this needs to be in place. Where is someone going to be living? Do they have legal documentation so that they can be in a society? Do they have what they need to have their basic needs met? From there, we want to start thinking about reintegration, which focuses more on economic, social, and civic integration. Next slide, please. We also need to be thinking potentially more specifically about rehabilitation, some specific programming. So this could be programs that are aimed at reducing risk for engaging or re-engaging in violent extremism. Next slide, please. And here there are, again, many domains that might play a role. So thinking about psychology. Is there a role for cognitive restructuring or helping to decrease black and white thinking? Religion, religious education and counseling, or fostering religious dialogue and debate. Under the social heading, thinking about exposure to new foods, new ideas, new places, new people and traditions, the idea of sort of expanding one's sense of identity and including connections to people who might be different from yourself as part of being able to integrate into society. And then referenced earlier, this idea around basic needs, but again, there's a role for potentially job security or jobs training and thinking about how do we make sure that we're reducing the barriers that someone might experience to fully integrating in society. Next slide, please. And then finally, resilience. And this was an area that hadn't really been labeled as such in many of the programs that we looked at. But what we found was that this was really a critical part of how we think about sustained success. So drawing on the literature around psychological resilience, what you can see is that there are two different domains. One, psychological factors, such as hope and optimism, that can increase resilience. And then structural opportunities for growth and connection. So what's happening in one's community, one's school, are there group or family activities or peer support? These kinds of structural and internal psychological factors can combine to create resilience or the ability to withstand the sort of inevitable challenges that everyone hits, individuals returning or reintegrating are going to face them as well. And how do you help make sure that they don't, in a moment of stress, return to ways that were maybe adaptive in managing stress in some ways, but obviously maladaptive in other ways. Next slide, please. So this model, much more described in some of the writings that we put together, and I think Steve included them with his QR code, is really, these are ideas that we're putting out there into your domain. And the goal is that these should really be taken by you in your communities and to think about how does this fit our context? What needs to change? What specific strengths and assets from this context can contribute to a robust 5R program? What domains are already in place and what areas could use future development? Next slide, please. Sorry, go 2 slides down. Across these different domains, we also highlighted key principles because how we do something is just as important as what we're doing. So the principles we identified include trauma-informed, taking a holistic, whole-of-society approach, being gender-sensitive and developmentally sensitive, human rights oriented, person-centered, culturally responsive, and strengths-based. Next slide. Let's move forward one more slide, please. Because before I run out of time here, I do want to touch on outcomes for a minute. The idea being, as we're doing this, we need to be thinking about, is what we're doing working? And what are we measuring to assess whether it's working? And you probably started to get a sense from the initial logic model I put up that outcomes are really going to be tied to these different domains. Did we successfully help someone meet their needs, have a sense of connection and community? Next slide, please. We developed an outcomes tool that has been implemented in a number of countries, including Kazakhstan. And the idea here is to look at, by report of the individual themselves, how well their needs around, go one slide further, please. Their needs are being met around citizenship, basic needs, access to services, health, emotional health, hope, safe and non-stigmatizing environment. It goes on, but it maps onto those different domains we talked about. What we are currently doing, and I wanted to make sure I drop this in before I wrap up, is we're working with partners both in Canada and the US to take this tool and adapt it for domestic contexts, to think about what needs to change, how do we need to think differently, maybe about social connection or social networks and how we assess that. And we're in the midst of developing a tool that hopefully can then be used in domestic contexts to think about whether these sort of holistic, person-centered programs are addressing that wide range of needs that we believe are fundamental to a successful program of reintegration. And I will end there. You can close the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. And again, last but not least, Mike.
It's always interesting being the panel that talks about trauma. We know how to really bring the energy down after lunch. When Juncal told me about this panel, we had talked about the different, possible contributions that I could make, and I mentioned and I volunteered to talk about the complexity of doing this work in very diverse social and cultural contexts, because we barely have agreement on how trauma shows up across space, time, culture, and place, let alone how it interacts with violence. So I'll start out just by a brief narrative that we use in the forthcoming RISE action guide with USIP. Shadi slowly gathered the pieces of what was once a lamp scattered across the room. A sense of regret overwhelmed him. He was angry with himself for once again breaking something. His wife cowered in the corner, shuddering. For years, Shadi had difficulty controlling his emotions, but the intensity, frequency, and violence of his outbursts had been growing since he came back from Syria. His wife had asked him nothing about his departure, nor his return. She had accepted his calls, which were rare, whenever he had reached out. But beyond the fact that he went to defend his friends, as he said, she knew nothing about his time as a fighter. She told people he was traveling for work, that he had a new venture with friends in Libya. Since returning, Shadi and his wife had spoken little. Sex was frequent, but mechanical, sometimes bordering on violent. Shadi spent much of his time at home, gregarious in his interactions with strangers, but practically a ghost in his own home, present, but mostly unseen, sitting in the same room from morning until night. Shadi could barely recall what made him explode in anger that particular night. Apologizing was no use because he knew it would happen again. As he picked up the pieces of the lamp, images of his father flashed across his mind. He hadn't wanted to be like his father. He had not wanted to hurt others the way his father had hurt him when he was a child. Shadi found himself mired in regret and resignation at what he had become. Thinking about it, let alone trying to find another way forward, seemed futile. The self-doubt and self-loathing had only grown worse since he returned from Syria. In his time as a fighter, he found little pleasure. He knew that he had signed up to kill people. In fact, he wanted to kill people, but not with such brutality, not with the casualness he witnessed. He had signed up to kill, but not to rape, not to torture. His time in Syria, despite his desperate longing to find a larger purpose and a place and build a place where he belonged, he had felt nothing but disappointment. Worse, now there was innocent blood on his hands, and he knew they were indeed innocent. And at any moment, one of the men he fought with could expose the full details of what he had done to the broader community. While Shadi's story comes from a place like Iraq and combines elements of multiple personalities and people that we've come across, there's so many elements of that that can and do resonate for working in the United States. But I think it's important, as Steve, Heidi, and Noah highlighted some of the particular elements of trauma that stand out in how it relates to the extremist journey, I think there's three things that in the United States we have to consider very carefully and how they interact with trauma, and those are the axes of religion, authoritarianism. We're talking about living in a democracy, working with folks in a democracy, where norms of things like patient-client confidentiality are accepted as fact, as opposed to being doubted every single minute of your interaction with a clinician. And thirdly, the normative environment surrounding violence. The normative environment around violence shows up very differently in a place like Iraq than in a place like Kazakhstan or in a place like Boston, where I grew up. And I grew up as the son of an evangelical Christian missionary and in the church, so I am deeply familiar with the safety that comes with obeying and living in a rigid ideology, and the lack of safety that shows up when you move away from that rigidity, and how that interacts with trauma. So there's just a couple of key points that I want to make in the lessons that I have learned personally from having the pleasure of learning from folks like Noah, Steve, and Heidi in the context of Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Maldives, and of course where I've spent most of my career in the Middle East. The first is that a lot of the, and I don't want to raise your hand if you work on the donor side of things here, but in your heart raise your hand if you're on the donor side of things here. The aid for R&R programs is completely separate from the reality and timeline of the aid for the structural situations that those very programs say that need fixing. So we have the 5R model. We have the RISE Action Guide from USIP. We have everyone and their mother has written best practices for R&R at this point. And all of them call for addressing some of the massive inequities and challenges that led to the sending of these folks in the first place, yet none of the funding is aligned because of a lack of coordination at the donor level. And I think that's a serious challenge and makes it very difficult when working on the issue of trauma, which is a generational, multi-year challenge. You can't fix it in 18 months, and I can't fix it by the end of your fiscal. The second point is that we often, having worked with many folks that have exited violence, and here I think also of the dozens of young men that I've worked with that were forced conscripts in the Syrian army who became refugees by no choice of their own because they precisely didn't want to fight. Do you know that most democratic countries refuse to resettle refugees with any combat experience, even if they were forced conscripts? So when I think of a lot of those men who I work with every single day, once they are in a place of safety, of physical and material safety, as Heidi alluded to, collapse is a very predictable response. And I've seen in the context of refugee resettlement, there's this notion of, you're safe now, you should be productive. You should get your shit together and get a job. It's Chatham House, I can say shit. Oh. No. Sorry, I thought it was. Sorry, Mom. The notion of accompanying folks when they come back from a place like Syria or Iraq to a place of material safety, there's an expectation, one, of gratitude, which is logical, because many folks do not make it home and countries don't take them back. So of course, there's an understandable gratitude that people experience for, This is a lot better than the context that I was just in. But the actual, if you look at the physiology of constant stress, there is a natural immobility or shutdown that can occur after massive periods of stress. And we don't necessarily always appreciate how that shows up for people. And actually, symptoms might get worse over time once someone moves into a place of physical and material safety. So making safety for folks is step one, but that's a long process as well, where we have to give a certain amount of time and expect that to fluctuate. Many folks have alluded today, and this is point number 3, to the challenging relationship between religious leadership and clinical leadership. And this is something that is particularly pronounced in other societies, not just in the United States. When I myself first went to see a therapist for my own issues, I worked with a biblical counselor. That's a perfectly valid line of work. Many pastors have opted for that type of career and whatnot. It's, in many cases, very devoid of any connection to diagnoses and referrals to a clinical practice or to other mental health professions, because it stands alone firmly within the faith leadership and faith-based counseling, pastoral counseling work. And we see this mirrored in places like Kazakhstan, where the clinicians that we work with were very much trained in a secular system, where understanding of how to integrate religious beliefs, ideology, dogma into the patient's identity is sort of anathema. And on the same hand, in the same vein, we also see, I can't remember the exact study, but it was a study that's saying globally, if you look at imams, less than 5% of imams globally have a degree in psychology. So this is another problem where the left hand isn't talking to the right, and where there's almost a trepidation and a fear of faith leadership and those who can accompany folks through that cognitive shift that can be difficult, to have some working knowledge of what's going on the other side and to not approach each other with fear and hesitance. And it makes it really difficult to meaningfully collaborate and cooperate. The fourth point is norms, and this was alluded to today as well. My family lives between Boston and Nashville, Tennessee. Those are different places on the map. Well, Nashville's also blue, but let's say Massachusetts and Tennessee. These are politically different environments where there's normative environments. And for me, growing up in the evangelical church outside of Boston was a very different experience than being an evangelical in Tennessee. And how I relate to my environment, if my exceptionalist views in some way, shape, or form were seen as normative or counter-normative, is different. And that affects how I relate to my own views and to the cognitive shifts that we try to instill in folks. So I think appreciating the challenge of working in places where there is a normative, I would say a lack of normative prohibition against violence, against outgroups. This can be challenging because violence isn't, go ahead, do it. Of course you should. So that makes it harder to promote some of those cognitive shifts. The last 2 points very quickly. Convincing authoritarian regimes to adopt a public health approach to anything is very difficult. Right? A lot of it is seen as soft. And as Noah, made very clear, ironically, the data indicates that there isn't much to be concerned with the vast majority of these folks that are coming home, because it's largely women and children, most of whom were probably not that radicalized in the first place, or with those base level interventions of psychosocial support and different soft interventions, folks will relatively be okay and not be a recidivism risk. However, in Kyrgyzstan, for example, when I was training probation officers, I gave a case study of someone who went through their time for an extremism-related offense, was released, and then 4 years later was picked up on a domestic violence charge. And you ask the room, is this a success study? Every man in the room raised his hand and said yes, and every female probation officer said no. So de-exceptionalizing violent extremism vis-a-vis other crimes in the process of R&R is a big challenge in places where there's certain norms and certain political environments where the primary security outcome is the be-all and end-all. And while we're pushing towards that in the United States, it's often not as easy in other places. And the very last point is on the notion of identity. I want to make it very clear that we have to differentiate between random traumas that people experience, like a car accident or a natural disaster, and traumas that are specifically related to who you are as a person or an identity that you hold. In much of the research and literature that studies interventions for folks affected by trauma, especially in the global south, gross term, but especially outside of the rich industrialized world, We assume that folks that are going to be included in a study because they have post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the inclusion and exclusion criteria. However, in places where you're talking about where the trauma that is experienced is precisely related to who you are as a person, or a credence or belief system or ethnic badge that you hold, it shows up differently, because one of the primary emotions that influences the trajectory of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms is shame. And so how clinicians deal with identity-based traumas, or when the trauma that you perpetrated or experienced is related to an identity that you hold, trying to disestablish the identity and problematize the identity can increase shame, which can complicate the journey away from PTSD towards recovery. So we have to be very sensitive when figuring, it's a chicken and egg problem, but a phased approach to how does de-radicalization sit alongside trauma care and trauma recovery? How do we stagger those in a way that we don't remove someone's fundamental safety-making view of the world, which was their religious or dogmatic posture, and first focus primarily on making them feel safe and try to reduce some of the symptoms that make their lives very difficult upon reentry.
Thank you. it's Mike has this ability to just, and now what do I say? So thank you for that. No, it's true. So before we start with the, I'm going to open the floor for Q&A, but before we do so, I wanted to ask a question first to all the panelists, and it actually. No, you gave me the inspiration for this question, sorry. So it's on you, but I would hope that everybody else would be able to contribute. I thought that image that you were describing about this snow-covered field where you quoted, "There's nothing left," right? How symbolic that is for the work that we're doing. Because unfortunately, when we're speaking about, resocialization, reintegration, rehabilitation, we can't do that. Like, we can't just eliminate everything that was there and start from scratch. It's basically impossible. So with that said, because we can't eliminate what has happened to people, I want to take that to the community trauma that you also spoke about and that Steve mentioned briefly. And how, of course, we've been talking of community trauma about as a precursor or something that can, impulsate that radicalization process. But I would also like to ask you about how that community trauma may not just continue to be pervasive even during these processes of migration, but the added layer of trauma that may come for communities that you were describing as hotspots, and how that is something that can neither be erased, like that is not a blank slate, and that is just an added layer of complication. So I would love your take on that, and of course, everybody else's on this. But you start because you inspired me for this. What do we do? Like, how do we handle a situation where there's indeed community-level trauma that was a precursor for radicalization, and on top of that, there's the added stigma that adds another layer of complication to another layer of trauma?
I think, at least I have to say on my part, that I don't have the answer to that question.
Well, you don't have it answer.
No, I wish I did. I think and as Mike mentioned, working in very authoritarian contexts, you're faced with this you're faced with a really steep challenge because you can't do anything without convincing the government first that it needs to be done or that it will benefit them somehow. And often, I take a lot of hope and some optimism in the fact that these very authoritarian states in Central Asia have made the unexpected and fairly brave decision to return so many people, but there is, and some have been more forward and open about needing to address problems in those communities that that contributed to all of these things happening in the first place, and not just say, although the default answer is still it's the faulty individual, or it's the poor personal choices that make people end up in Syria in an extremist group or something like that, and it's sort of on or off. The children didn't make the poor personal choices, and so we're not going to blame them for it. The adults, it's a failure to bootstrap yourself, and then you're sent back expecting to take that bootstrap approach to your own rehabilitation. Actually, I won't say which country it is. One of the countries, the economic assistance that they offer to returnees is $2,000 business startup loans at 28% interest. So, talk about your bootstraps. Just to get back to your question, though, I think there needs to be room, and I don't know how to communicate this to governments or who the right allies are to communicate this, but there needs to be some kind of room for these communities to be able to talk about the traumas that their communities have faced. And the direction for these things has gone very much in the opposite way. So, for example, this to go back to this community in Kazakhstan, which is the area around the city of Jezkazgan. It was the largest of the camps in the Steplog system, part of Soviet history. So it should be relatively easy, to acknowledge these things. Stalin was denounced in 1956. All of this stuff has happened. But for the political winds are not going in that direction. Within Russia, the history of the whole Gulag system is being erased. And there's a lot of pressure for Kazakhstan to do the same thing. There's a lot of political pressure against, sort of digging up these skeletons from the closet. But I think it's a really important part of the process for people to have access to a positive meaning-making process that would be pro-social for these things, rather than, your only options are you shut up or you join ISIS. Those two things don't seem like, that doesn't seem like a good choice to give to people, but it is in many cases sort of the choice that they were faced with.
I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to Noah's response. Otherwise, I don't know if we have any. Do we have questions? Okay. Just for the sake of time, if we don't mind, we're going to start with the online folk, because the people who are here in the room will have the chance to, ask the questions, during coffee break. That's coming right now while we change panels, and later today. So please go ahead.
So is learning how to navigate and heal trauma more useful as a preventative to radicalization, a precondition to a pathway of rehabilitation, or a pathway itself to rehabilitation? Let me know if I should repeat that.
Is this a question for anybody in particular?
No, this is just for the general panel. Apologies, I didn't say that.
No.
But, yeah.
This is a question from Mike.
That's a question. I think yes to the first two, but not to the third. I don't think it's a substitute for. I don't think that trauma treatment is a substitute for the dimensions of all the dimensions and complexity of the things that Heidi laid out in the 5R model, but it should be a part of those things in different ways. And maybe I'll take a crack at some of the stuff that Noah was asked before. Remember, we're talking about a low frequency, for the most part, a low frequency event. So many people in many villages and cities were exposed to the kinds of things Noah's talking about, but a relatively small number of them chose to do this. And so, one could reflect that there are many other bad outcomes that those people can get involved in, such as domestic violence and drinking too much, and now, choosing to become a foreign fighter can be added to that list in the U.S. too, in a way that it just wasn't on the table before necessarily. So let's not, as maybe Mike said, let's not over exceptionalize this phenomenon of getting involved in violent extremism and take it out of the context of all the other bad behaviors that people can get involved in. I also wanted to read a really good quote from Kai Erikson. Kai Erikson is a sociologist who studied natural disasters, which always have a human-made component to it, as Noah explained in telling the story of what happened in that village. And Kai Erikson wrote a great book called Everything in Its Path, in which he studied a mining disaster in Tennessee. And there's a quote from the book: "The vulnerable have already been herded into places where disasters are more likely to strike." Think about Gaza for a moment, or other such camps. And so there's a way, and you have displacement, layered upon displacement, layered upon dehumanization, layered upon state-sponsored violence, and this is part of the fabric of life. This is that you called multi-generational trauma, and so that has to be understood and appreciated in society. But those pressures, will lead a very small number of people to enter into an ecological niche where they may be picked off by a recruiter, or their cousin may suggest, well, why don't you come to Syria like I'm going to? So it's not just the collective processes or even the individual processes of trauma that lead to this. It takes another level of, say, kind of randomness to explain how people get there. And I just want to say one other thing. After Mike was talking, I was thinking about moral injury. We should add moral injury to the list of kind of traumatic-like experiences. If you haven't heard of the term moral injury, it really refers to people who have been put in a position where they had to do something that kind of violated their own moral code. Like, I signed up to go and kill people, but I didn't sign up to rape. And so it requires a different kind of approach to working with people who've gone through moral injury. And there's a lot of literature out there on that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Darlene, do we have any more questions online? Yes. We probably have room for like two. We
Okay.
overran a little bit,
Well,
sorry.
Great, thank you. This is not directed at anyone in particular. Would having broader discussion of how to navigate trauma be useful as a prophylactic against radicalization, or would it be more helpful in a narrow context of helping someone who is radicalized, de-radicalize, and reintegrate? Even that first part works.
I think we're of the belief that those conversations should happen anyways, and that they're good for health and mental health outcomes. If you just look at things like adverse childhood experiences, are related to higher rates of substance abuse, of getting cardiac illness, hypertension, diabetes. So they're linked with a profound number of bad outcomes, and we have not addressed that well enough, so those things need to be addressed. And there's a whole trauma, mental health movement that's trying to do that. Why don't you pick it up from there?
I'll just offer very briefly that I don't think it's by any means a solution to either of those things. As Steve already mentioned, it's not a substitute. It's sort of a, well, it probably won't hurt. For me, I think of two things. You know, the utility of offering, for example, mental health services, trauma-focused mental health services in Zaatari refugee camp, where I spend most of my career in Jordan. People don't have electricity. They can't leave without a police permit. They don't have clean water. It's not a place where that feels really conducive to trauma recovery. So you have to be really understanding of what can you expect as meaningful gains in this context.
Okay, but I want to, a little bit push back on that. Working in Tajikistan, a huge percentage of women have been exposed to sexual harassment, violence, family violence, and blame themselves for it, essentially, and get involved in really bad, worsened family situations. You spend an hour or so with those women, explain to them it's not your fault. But you gotta own what happened to you, and there are strategies by which you can manage your dysregulation. There are strategies by which you can manage your violent husband, and you don't have to do this to your children, and they can work with that.
So what I was going to say, mid-sentence, was that because the pushback that we get is, why are you doing mental health and trauma recovery work in a place where there's so many other basic needs that are unmet and the environment isn't conducive to general health and well-being? But there's the demystifying component that Steve is hitting on. I remember in the first several times that we did our psychoeducation work in Zaatari camp, we have a chapter of the curriculum that we have that mentions the logic of having a thought like, maybe I would be better off if I could just not be alive. This small thought that creeps up in the darkness of night, that's a very taboo topic in many communities of the Middle East. And we got a lot of pushback of saying, you can't talk about suicide here. It's going to encourage it. After the session, 3 young women all came up to me and showed me the scars on their wrists from cutting themselves. So it's those moments of demystifying what is going on inside of me, why it feels so difficult to navigate this, that process of demystifying the effects, the impacts of stress and trauma can be in and of itself incredibly empowering and lead to a lot more solutions-oriented behaviors and help-seeking externally.
Yeah.
On that thought, I am terribly sorry to have to cut this short. But sorry also for the people online whose questions were unanswered. Sorry, that one's on me. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heidi, Mike, Steve, Noah. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. Thank you for being here. And for the rest of the crowd, we're going to take a short coffee break, shorter than expected. Again, that's my fault. Feel free to blame it on me, and we'll resume in like 5 minutes? 5 minutes.